But you can't go just yet because we've got to do all the summing up and conclusion stuff. And I'm now sitting here thinking, oh my gosh, these 2 days, and I've got to try to sum them up somehow or other. And there's a few sort of seminal bits that just sort of strike me. The first is the bit that I mentioned in yesterday's summing up, which was Gerd's opening. You know, if Henry Ford had asked the people what they wanted, they'd have said faster horses. And then so the rest of today, we've been trying to figure out a little bit more about what are the things that drive demand. Now here I have to make a small digression onto the word demand, and Bronwyn's left, I think, so I'm on fairly safe ground. I had an economist who used to work for me, who then actually went on to work for the Commerce Commission by the name of Dr. Chris Funston, otherwise known as Dr. Fun. And Chris had this day where I was asking him to do an exercise for me, and so he went off to ask the engineers for the demand for a product. And what Chris was expecting to get for the demand for a product was the demand schedule. At these price points, there would be this much demanded. But what the engineers gave him was the quantity that they had forecast would be sold. And he's trying to do an economic model and trying to figure out whether we should or shouldn't do something, working on the assumption that the price we charge might actually have some impact on the number of units we'd sell. And all the engineers could talk about was how the model they'd built had a certain assumption about the number of units to be sold. And that's sort of like interesting, because when we're talking about demand in this context, we're talking about actually not the demand schedule itself, but those factors that would influence and shape a demand schedule. Those of you who know me well would also recognise that as a not particularly normal person, I don't actually believe the demand schedule exists anywhere beyond, is not really well defined anywhere outside of the point at which the current market is operating. But you still can ask the question, what shapes demand? And that's really the question we're asking, not what will drive demand per se, but what will shape demand, what will be the things that will factor into the creation of the demand. And so we then come to the conversations around each of the 4 sessions today: consumer, business, rural, e-health and e-education. And I think the summary points for me that came out of that was, look, whilst we had sessions here about video, news and games, it's hard to get away from the idea that really the thing that drives the application here in consumer, an important driver in consumer land, is entertainment. And that worries people sometimes, because they worry about whether entertainment is a valuable economic good. And the games man, who's Stephen, rightly pointed out, well, we recognise it in the GDP. A standard economic theorist will tell you if it's what people prefer to spend their money on over something else, it's a valued good. It should not be not preferenced against anything else if people in the community preference it for their choice. So don't disparage it. But equally, don't disparage the value that those things can give you. And once again, the gaming community, developing games gives you a range of skills. Developing video content gives you the chance to take your story to other places. The business session, the SME session, I mean, I might be biased, but what I sort of thought I heard from the business people was they want to do more of what they do now, but do it more reliably. There are stories about they've tried to do things with video conferencing, but it doesn't always work. They want to move their files around, but they want to do it better. And for me, sort of for the driver there, it's not just a question about giving them the fatter pipe, it's about giving them the way that it works better. And then the rural people talked to us a little bit about, and it's a really important thing that people don't understand, about how important it is to attract people to live in rural areas, that they can get the opportunity to do things the way they do in the city. Particularly true for some of this health and education stuff. A teacher who's used to having access to broadband in the city actually finds going to a place where they can't get broadband an impediment to moving. It's actually quite significant. They should be able to get access at their schools, but you'd be surprised sometimes their schools don't let them get to their social networking sites on the school computer. Certainly the health computers and things will have that issue. And secondly, there was a real sense amongst the rural people that they were saying, don't worry, build it and we will come. Build it and we will come. And finally, the e-health area, was fascinating. But we had people saying we need to do the thinking about this. We need to use the technology people already use. A lot of it's about care coordination, reducing errors. But I liked the phrase that some person, I can't remember which person was, used about talking about the fact that what we've actually got to come is overcome learned helplessness. It's all too big, there's nothing I can do about it. And to a degree, that brings me to sort of my final big summary point for what at least I've observed in the conference over the last couple of days. Yesterday especially, we had a number of comments about things that weren't necessarily in the scope of this study because it's the Commerce Commission, issues of copyright, issues of content regulation. Today we've had a number of people who've sort of expressed a desire that the Minister might have said something more about what she was going to do about content regulation or what she was going to do about further broadband speeds. And that's where I come back to the point that Liz Evans made, which is that it's about leadership, but she's doing it. She's going to do leadership to actually encourage people in her rural women's network to get online. That's the opportunity. It seems to me, and I'm a blow-in from across the ditch, so you're allowed to ignore me completely, and you probably will, but it seems to me that there's a whole lot of things that could actually be progressed a bit further without waiting for the Commerce Commission to decide there's a market failure and they need to intervene, that there's a content issue that they need the government to intervene on, or there's a copyright issue that you've got a copyright issue, but there's been in the course of the last 2 days a lot of things talked about. There'd be a really great shame if they just stopped here. Creating the broadband future doesn't end when today ends. And I suppose my question for you is do you want to take a choice point that says we've had a nice conference, the Commerce Commission will write a report, and then we'll move on and do some things? Or do those of you who are interested enough to have come along and participate today decide that actually this is a conversation you'd like to keep going? One of the speakers we had here yesterday was Anthony Walker from the Broadband Stakeholders Group in the UK. I mean, that's a group of people from industry. Yes, they get some support from the government, but that's a group of people who concern themselves with what are the issues that are important in the take-up and the use of broadband. And so whilst I think there are some interesting things, and there are some things about business models, there's definitely conversations you need to have about what one speaker very, very neatly summarised as the cool shit. And while there's also a real need for you to listen to the calls from the rural community to go and meet the people, in the rural areas, go and meet the people at the Murray and ask them a bit about what their needs are. To do all that, you possibly need to say, do we want the Future with High Speed Broadband group that takes the responsibility for taking those issues further? So that's just a thought for you, my own observation, that I think you've contributed so much over 2 days, it would be a pity for it to end with what will no doubt be a brilliant report written by the Commerce Commission. And I'd like to just point out one last thing to you on that theme, which is, of course, that the Commerce Commission very conveniently used a website called broadbandfuture.co.nz, not .gov. So if you wanted to co-opt that website from them, I'm sure you could have a useful negotiation about, in fact, saying what the Commerce Commission's 2-day conference was a good place to start an ongoing conversation in New Zealand about building the future with high-speed broadband, not a single point in time. That said, I've used up my time. I've used up my welcome. I thank you all for the contributions you've all made over the last 2 days. That's all of you in the room and all of those out there somewhere who have been variously twittering and feeding back in. I thought the conference organisers, and Ross will say more about that in a second, have done an excellent job and put together a really great program of speakers. We fixed the gender balance in that last panel. I was pleased to see that. Also very pleased to see how much more culturally sensitively aware the last panel was than other panels. That was just an interesting tweak, the difference between the business consumer panels and that last e-health and e-education one. That said, can I just thank you for the welcome. Thank you all for your participation, and most importantly, thank the Commerce Commission for organising such a great conference. And I'll pass you over to Ross to formally close.